you need to know ahead of time. The other sponsors are junkscience.com, the CO2 Coalition, and the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Our panel discussion is going to try to focus on several different aspects of the Biden plan, what's going on with the climate summit, what's going on with the American Jobs Plan, the so-called infrastructure package, the Paris Treaty commitments, and some of the science that the Biden administration and its supporters don't pay attention to. So we're going to begin with Steve Milloy of junkscience.com. He's the publisher. He's a lawyer and biostatistician by training. He's been working on these issues and a lot of other environmental and public health issues for about 30 years. And I don't know if he's getting tired yet, but I am. Steve has been in various purchases as he's pursued these issues, but he's also an author of several books, including his most recent, which I highly recommend, Scared to Death. So with that, please go ahead, Steve.
Okay. Let's see. I'm trying. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
All right. So my presentation is Joe Biden's climate road to nowhere, but don't get the impression that I'm prejudging it. What I want to provide is a framework for thinking about this. As we go through the next 4 years this week, I think there are questions people need to ask about Joe Biden's climate plan. Where are we going with it? What's the goal? How do we get there? What are we going to have to do? Can it be done? What's the cost? Is it really possible, physically possible to do, politically possible, financially possible? And then at the end, is it worth it? Now, Democrats want to spend trillions of dollars, which all are going to have to be printed for this. Joe Biden's his infrastructure plan is $2.6 trillion. I estimate maybe a third of that is earmarked as climate. There may be more. Joe Biden wants to do 50%. His Paris commitment will probably be 50% emissions cuts by 2030, which is essentially half the Green New Deal. AOC and Ed Markey have this Thrive Act. They want to spend $10 trillion over 10 years. And the Green New Deal, I think, is being reintroduced today, which is a $100 trillion project. So that's a lot of money they want to spend. What should we get for spending trillions? When you spend money, you usually get something. We should get our money's worth, whatever that is. And so there should be some basic cost benefit analysis done here. Merely spending money and cutting emissions is not good enough. Cutting emissions is not a benefit without any other benefit to climate or public health or something. So after we spend all this money, all these trillions, the climate should improve, right? Or should be less dangerous. And whatever those terms mean, that's not even really well defined. Biden, a couple weeks ago in a press conference, promised fewer hurricanes on the East Coast. But we need to have benefits that are tangible, meaningful, and commensurate with the amount of money we're going to spend. Real costs should produce real benefits. Some basic facts that you can use to evaluate these claims. Global emissions are 59 billion tons per year. And according to the UN, they're going up with no end in sight. US emissions are a little more than 10% of that, 6 billion tons, and decreasing as a share of global emissions. Very important, on Climate Day at the White House in January, John Kerry said, we could go to zero tomorrow and the problem isn't solved. So, the United States could basically stop emitting today and forever, and the problem, whatever problem there is, if there is a problem, is not solved. So what is the value for us if we're going to spend trillions of dollars, going way beyond their goals, and still the problem is not solved? Now, I want to give us a couple smaller sort of micro examples. You can examine all parts of Biden's plan. These are some micro examples. Biden wants to federalize the car fleet. It's about 645,000 vehicles. They emit about 3 million tons per year. That's about 5% of global emissions, 0.005% of global emissions. Obviously, even if he electrifies the entire fleet, that's not going to make a difference in terms of climate. The cost works out to be about $1,000 per ton of CO2. It's very expensive versus, like even today's, cost for in Europe for emissions credits. And if you really thought that the federal fleet, if that was really going to benefit us, well, there's cheaper ways to go about it. You could just buy offsets from TerraPass, $10 per vehicle per month, millions versus billions. And of course, regardless, in my view, the weather is going to stay the same no matter what you do. Extreme weather. Biden has promised, he wants to reduce the frequency and intensity of hurricanes. At least that's what he says his plan is going to do. NOAA recently estimated that the average annual cost of all extreme weather over the past 40 years has been $46.5 billion per year. Not all of that is hurricanes, obviously. So, Biden spent $900 billion to avoid damages, decades into the future. Does that really make sense? And NOAA itself says that global warming over the past 40 years has been worth an average of 2 extra named storms and 1 hurricane, not a major hurricane, per year. Is this really worth avoiding? I mean, is this really worth spending billions and billions and billions of dollars? And can anything really be done? And how would we know? I think these are all valuable questions to ask. The last example is electricity mandates. This is key because Biden wants to make the grid carbon neutral. University of Chicago, which is not a hotbed of climate denialism, has an ongoing study, and they found that electricity prices have gone up from the existing state electricity mandates. Emissions have gone down a little bit, 10 to 25%, but what are the benefits? The electricity prices going up, that's real, there's a real cost. People are actually paying that. But what are the benefits anyone's getting? I can't tell you what the benefit is of a 25% reduction in CO2 emissions, from our utilities. It's just, I don't think it's a benefit at all. And keep in mind that global emissions are going up anyway. So in conclusion, what are we getting for spending trillions on climate? I mean, this is what people should be asking. I can't see anything describable climate-wise, which it's, by definition, this is a waste of money. I know that a lot of people on the other side of the issue think that, well, we need to show global leadership, and that's a really benefit. But we're only 10% of emissions and decreasing. We're an increasingly small part of whatever this is. China, India, I mean, they deny responsibility for historic emissions, and they're not going to cut theirs. And finally, China's goal is to be the lone global superpower by 2049, not to be carbon neutral. And I think that as we go forward, please consider all these things when you hear climate discussed, and for any legislation that is pending in Congress. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you, Steve. Our next speaker, we're going to move from some of the policy and the economics to some of the science with James Taylor, who is president of the Heartland Institute. And he's continuing as the director of the Arthur B. Robinson Center on Climate and Environmental Policy at the Heartland Institute, and he has been directing Heartland's climate policy for most of the past 20 years. So it's good to see you, James. Please go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Myron and Steve. Great presentation. The trillions of dollars that Steve outlined are predicated on the notion that we are facing a climate crisis, an imminent climate catastrophe. But we shouldn't just take folks' word for it. We should look under the hood and see what the science says. And the scientific evidence is quite clear that we are not facing a climate crisis. So I'd like to present just a few slides that'll give you a summary of that, and we can talk more about that in Q&A if you like. First of all, it's important to keep in mind the appropriate context of current temperatures. We often hear that 10 of the past 11 years are the hottest years on record, or the highest temperatures on record were in the past decade, whatever it may be. But whenever you hear this, the key phrase is, quote, on record, because the climate activists describe, quote, the record as merely the past 100 years, which is just a small speck of time in comparison to the length of time that human civilization has been around, or even before that. So let's look at context to see if we really are facing a climate crisis. This chart here, these are data presented by the European Science Foundation. And what happened here is scientists drilled into the Greenland ice sheet, and extracting ice cores, they're able to analyze oxygen isotopes and derive past temperature. It's not a controversial method. So what you have here, if you look at the top right slide, these are temperatures of the past 10,000 years, going from, on the left, 10,000 years ago, to temperatures that exist today at the far right. And what you can see is that even with the warming of the past century or century and a half here that you see at the far right, temperatures are still cooler than has been the case for most of the past 10,000 years. That is hardly a climate crisis. You can see underneath that, the bottom chart shows temperatures of the past 2,000 years. You can see 1,000 years ago, temperatures were warmer than today. And that's why today, when we see a little bit of ice and snow melting in Greenland, what's being revealed is whole villages that used to exist and thrive because temperatures were warmer then. Again, this is the scientific evidence showing that temperatures are actually abnormally cool, not warm. By the way, on the far left, at the top left, what you're seeing is temperatures of the past 100,000 years. This shows the ice age period, the glaciation that finally abated 10,000 years ago. And again, at the far right, you see temperatures today are cooler than they were 5,000, 10,000 years ago. Now, some folks may say, well, maybe that Greenland ice project is flawed. But here we have, this is a chart that was published by the United Nations itself. This is their own chart. And what you see here in the middle chart, you see temperatures of the past 10,000 years. Again, on the far right, temperatures today, even with the cooling of the past century, are significantly cooler than temperatures that have predominated during the time period of human civilization. This is not a grand experiment. This is not some climate crisis. This is nothing unprecedented. The hottest years on record are not occurring right now. They occurred thousands of years ago. And by the way, humans without today's technologies not only survived, but thrived during these temperature periods. Let's move forward. Here on the far right, you see temperatures of the past 40 years measured very precisely by NASA satellites. And what you see is that temperatures are rising at about 0.14 degrees per decade. That is not very alarming. In fact, the United Nations predicted much more warming than we're seeing in the real world. So if you look on the right, I have extracted some text. The United Nations IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their first assessment predicted 0.3 degrees warming per decade. Then in 2018, just a couple of years ago, they had to walk back that prediction. And now they say they expect 0.2 degrees Celsius of warming per decade. They've already acknowledged that they were at least as far off in their prediction as skeptics like myself were saying when we looked at the temperature record of the past century and said temperatures are warming at a pace of about 1 degree Celsius per century, or about 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade. We were called deniers, we were called mavericks, and yet the United Nations admits we were at least as close to temperatures as they were. But in fact, we're even closer to temperature increases than the United Nations, because as you see on the far right, temperatures are rising much closer to 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade than 0.3 or even 0.2. In other words, the temperature predictions of accelerating global temperatures simply have not occurred, and there's no indication that's going to change anytime in the near future. Here, I'd like to take a look at some of the extreme weather events that are predicted to run amok under global warming. So Steve mentioned hurricanes earlier, and here on the far right, we have, this is data from tropical storms and hurricanes going back 50 years. And what you see is that as temperatures have increased modestly, we haven't seen an increase in hurricanes. In fact, not only do the data show that, but the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change itself admits this. Here is a quote from their 2018 interim report. There is, quote, only low confidence for the attribution of any detectable changes in tropical cyclone activity to anthropogenic influences. That's very important because in media report after media report, indeed, in the text of a Green New Deal bill that's going to be introduced in the US Senate next week. The assertion is that the IPCC has documented that climate change is causing more hurricanes, is causing more extreme weather events, but the IPCC says nothing of the sort. More importantly, the data shows nothing of the sort. By the way, for brevity, I'm only showing hurricanes, but the same is true for tornadoes, floods, droughts, wildfires, etc. One final slide before we move to our next speaker. It's not all about deflecting claims of climate alarm. It's important to keep in mind that there are many substantial benefits to higher atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations and to warmer temperatures. So here you see this graph is taken directly from the NASA website. And what NASA documents is there has been a substantial greening of the Earth throughout this century, throughout the 20 years since the year 2000. Here we see that throughout the Earth, there has been an increase in average leaf area of about 5% during that time period. And that's on top of increases that NASA documented late in the 20th century. With a greening Earth, we have substantial benefits. Not only do we see deserts receding, we see more lush vegetation. We've also seen substantial increases in global crop production. These are tremendous benefits that we can't overlook or just sweep under the rug. So as a whole, when we look at the scientific case for these expensive plans that Joe Biden and others are proposing, the scientific evidence simply isn't there. And it's important to keep that in mind. To the extent that climate change is impacting human health and welfare and the environment, it's been primarily beneficial, not harmful. So thank you, and I turn it back over to Myron.
Thank you, James. We are going to continue with the science with Gregory Wrightstone, who is the executive director of the CO2 Coalition, one of the sponsors of our event today. Greg is a professional geologist, and he is the author of a book, Inconvenient Facts, published in 2017, which remains on the bestseller list in several categories on Amazon. So take it away, Greg.
Thank you, Myron. In this segment, we'll take a look at just some of the many benefits that are accruing to the Earth's ecosystems and humanity due to the combination of modest warming and increased CO2. Looking back over the last several thousand years, back to the beginning of the rise of the first great empires and civilizations, we see that there have been three other warm periods, very similar to what we're in right now. All three were warmer than today. We know that from things like the Vikings growing barley on Greenland. We can't do that now. Our Romans growing citrus in the north of England. And before climate science became politicized, these other warm periods were known as climate optima. And they were called climate optima for very good reasons, because both Earth's ecosystems and humanity benefited. Probably the greatest untold story that I like to say about the late 20th and early 21st century is what James just talked about, this notable greening of the Earth. According to NASA, up to 50% of the Earth is greening, is what they call it, which is increasing vegetation. Up to 50% is greening. Less than 4% of the Earth, again, according to NASA, is browning or loss of vegetation. That's a pretty good trade-off, and I take that any day of the week. We don't see this increase in vegetation just in tropical and subtropical, but in polar regions, and impressively in many of the arid regions around the globe: Australia, India, China, and Africa. Probably the starkest example we see of this greening of the Earth is in the southern Sahara, an area known as the Sahel. 700,000 square kilometers of former desert, the former Sahara Desert, are now turning into lush grasslands. Trees are growing. People are moving back into this area of the Sahel where they haven't lived there in 1,000 years. They're planting crops and growing crops. So this is a great benefit, of course, to those people, and we're seeing this again worldwide. And it's not just any vegetation that we're seeing; it's all of the major forms of vegetation are seeing this increase in growth, from forests to grasslands to croplands. We see a huge greening, according to the study from Boston University. This has been going on for 30, 40, 50 years. One of the biggest tragedies that are predicted, and they're stating is going to happen, is famine associated with man-made global warming. But when we look at the actual data, we find that the globe, the United States, globally growing crops are breaking records year after year. Part of that's due to mechanization and improved farming practices for sure, but it's also being turbocharged by our changing climate. Warmer temperatures mean the growing seasons are lengthened. Killing frosts stop earlier in the spring and arrive later in the fall. That leads to longer growing seasons and more plantings and more to be harvested. And it's really being turbocharged too by this increasing CO2 that's fueling plant growth. According to Craig Idso, a 300 part per million increase in CO2 would lead to, get this, a 46% increase in worldwide crop growth. So because of increasing temperature and increasing CO2, we can feed a growing population. Impressively, this chart of United States corn bushels per acre grain yield coincides so closely with carbon dioxide emissions that it's stunning. The blue line here, of course, is the carbon dioxide emissions globally, and the dots that you see is the grain yield, bushels per acre. As CO2 rises, so do crop yields. Very impressive and a very enlightening chart here. We're also being told that heat waves are increasing and that they'll increase in the future, but the data tells us something different. This data here from both the EPA and NOAA show that heat waves have been in a long-term decline for at least the last 90 years. Another great tragedy that's predicted by the global warming enthusiasts is this dangerous rise in sea level. But again, the data tells us something completely different. This landmark study looked at over 1,000 tide gauges, and these tide gauges are the best long-term measurement of sea level. This shows us that sea level began rising in the mid-1800s, and it's continued at about the same rate since then, with no acceleration in the rise due to any increases in CO2. Since the beginning of the 20th century, we've seen an 8-inch rise in global sea level. Nothing alarming there. And it's in 2005, the UN issued a report claiming that there'd be 50 million climate refugees by 2010. Of course, that didn't happen. One of their most at-risk island nations that they pointed to were the Maldives. It's an archipelago of 25 coral atolls in the Arabian Sea. They were predicted the Maldives to be long ago underwater. Well, what's going on in the Maldives right now? There are 17 resort complexes being constructed in the Maldives. This is tens of millions of dollars of investment by equity companies, all of which are insured by insurance companies. And I don't have to tell you that both equity companies and insurance companies avoid risk like the plague. If they had envisioned that actually sea level was going to be rising at the levels that are predicted, they wouldn't be investing tens of millions of dollars in these supposedly high-risk areas. So in conclusion, I'll say that by nearly every metric, the Earth's ecosystems are prospering, and humanity is benefiting from a combination of the rising temperature and increasing CO2. So while the Biden administration says that their plans are a solution to the climate crisis, I call them a solution in search of a problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregory. I'm going to finish up now by going back to some of the things that Steve Milloy talked about at the beginning from a slightly different perspective, but there's some overlap. And perhaps I'll get my hands a little bit dirtier in the political and policy debate here. So Jim, if you could start my screen. Let's go to the beginning here. Good. I also have road in my title, the Biden-Harris Roads to Climate Nirvana and the Potholes Along the Way. Next slide. Okay, so how is the Biden administration and how are its supporters in Congress going to get to climate nirvana? Well, they've got three main routes: the Paris Climate Treaty, what I would call the regulatory rampage of going back to the Obama administration regulations and reviving them and enlarging them, expanding them. And finally, this odd climate / infrastructure / tax package, which the Biden-Harris administration calls the American Jobs Plan. Next slide. Let's start with the last, the most recent, the Jobs Plan. It consists of taxing and spending over $2 trillion of new taxes over 15 years, which will, of course, take money out of the economy. When you tax something, let's say for $1 billion, you take more than $1 billion out of the economy. It varies according to what kind of tax it is, but you're taking out, let's say, 1.2 billion or 1.5 billion. So the tax side is clearly going to slow down the economy, and that may be good for greenhouse gas emissions. That may reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, Steve already mentioned that most of the so-called infrastructure package has very little to do with infrastructure, and it has very little to do with climate and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the largest single item is expanding federal payments to home and community health care. That's $400 billion. So you'll see that this package is really not so much about the climate or about reducing emissions. And in fact, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's chief of staff told the Washington Post, and if I can change my view here, and I'm going to read it. This is from Saikat Chakrabarti, who is the chief of staff to Representative Ocasio-Cortez. And he told the Washington Post a couple of years ago, the interesting thing about the Green New Deal, he said, is it wasn't originally a climate thing at all. Ricketts, who was talking to him in a coffee shop, greeted this startling notion with an attentive poker face. Chakrabarti continued, do you guys think of it as a climate thing? Because we really think of it as a how do you change the entire economy kind of thing. And so that's what we are looking at with the mini Green New Deal that President Biden and his administration have proposed. Next slide. Now I want to mention some highlights of the regulatory rampage. And this is where I think the Biden administration, if it's successful and gets through the court in 3 or 4 years, through the Supreme Court and the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, I think that the administration can get some modest emissions cuts. So they have, in particular, I think the key one is replacing the Trump Cafe rule, which in itself was a replacement of the Obama Cafe rule, and give California back its waiver under the Clean Air Act so that they can go ahead and tell California can run American policy for what kind of cars people can drive and buy. Then there are the various greenhouse gas rules for utilities, for power plants, but also for other industries like cement and steel and refining. And then all of those are going to reduce emissions a little bit, but then maybe they can get creative. Maybe they can create a secondary ozone NAAQS, a National Ambient Air Quality Standard for ozone, which is a minor greenhouse gas. And that secondary NAAQS will then allow the EPA to take over running the entire economy, or perhaps I should say Gina McCarthy in the White House to take over running the entire economy. They could also use something called Section 115 of the Clean Air Act, which would allow them to use international relations essentially to regulate domestic greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, the jobs plan contains something that, if it is enacted, will give the administration and the EPA essentially control over the entire economy. And that is called the Clean Electricity Standard, which would mandate, as it's proposed, that all of our electricity produced in this country be produced without producing carbon dioxide emissions by 2035. Now, let's go into the next slide. The other route that President Biden is going to try to take, I believe, is through using the Paris Climate Treaty as the basis for claiming that without a national debate, without ratification by the Senate, without votes by Congress, that he can create a target for reducing emissions and get it through the courts. And the court will say, well, yes, because we've signed on to the Paris Climate Treaty, even though the Senate hasn't ratified it, you can go ahead and do all these things, and this is your authority. So the Obama nationally determined contribution at the time the Paris Treaty was signed in 2015 was to reduce emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. It's rumored that before the Global Leaders Climate Summit starts online on Earth Day, on Thursday, which President Biden is hosting, that the administration will make a second round commitment, and it's rumored to be 50% by 2030. Now, what I want to say about these things, and if we could go to the next slide, Jim. This is historical emissions, and I wish I could have found a better one that started in 1950 that could show more detail. But you will note that Chinese emissions are now larger annually than United States emissions and European Union emissions combined. And so while President Biden is undertaking a multi-trillion-dollar attempt to reduce US emissions, which I think, as Steve pointed out, will be futile. It will be incredibly expensive, but it won't reduce emissions very much. While we do that, while we hamstring our economy, destroy our energy independence, destroy our oil and gas and coal industries, which have made us the world's largest energy producer, while we do all those things, China is continuing at a very fast clip to build new coal-fired power plants. India is also building a lot of new coal-fired power plants because they still have hundreds of millions of people who do not have access to adequate or any electricity. And so what is happening here is that China and India are pursuing realistic policies to benefit their people, which is odd for a communist country, I would say, like China. Whereas the American Republic is going to embark on a course of energy poverty and economic devastation based on no mandate from the people or from the Congress. It's going to be the administration going it alone, saying, we don't really need you. We can just wave our magic wand and completely transform the economy as is the goal of the Green New Deal. So last slide, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. And I think we have plenty of time for questions. I already see some in the chat and in the Q&A. And I believe Jim Lakely is going to start out with the questions that some of the first questions that came through. Jim?
Thank you, Myron. Yes, we've had several questions in the chat and in the Q&A, and I appreciate that. And we'll see how many we can get through here in the 24 minutes that we have remaining in our planned time. Just a quick housekeeping note. Several of you have asked if this presentation will be available for viewing later, and the answer is yes. Everyone on this call will be getting a link to this video when it's up on Heartland's YouTube page, which is Heartland Tube on YouTube. And there's also discussion if people would like to have the slideshows that all of our speakers have presented. I don't want to speak for them, but I'm sure that will be arranged and it'll be just fine. And we can have those to anyone who would like to request that. You can always email me at jlakely@heartland.org. And I can, if you have any questions and any follow-ups, and I'll be able to help you out. Looking at some of the questions here, let's see. Real Jean Isaac asked via email before we started this webinar. Since we cannot convince Biden or Kerry that there is no climate emergency, how can we mobilize an effective opposition to their policies? Who are we hoping to convince? Is there a practical way to mobilize opposition to stop them? Who would like to go first?
Well, if I'll just say one thing. I think that voters need to convince members of Congress, primarily Republican members of Congress, that they shouldn't dance around with this issue and say, oh, yes, we agree that climate change is a serious issue. We just don't want to spend as much money on it and do as much damage to the economy as you want to do, you Democrats and you, President Biden. The fact is that all of these pretend policies that the Republican leadership is putting forward will be costly, but they will do even less. They will be completely inadequate to address the alleged problem. What voters need to remind their elected officials in Congress is that this isn't a real problem. This is a problem based on enriching the climate industrial complex, not on saving the Earth from global warming.
And if I can add, that's a great point, Myron. We are inundated by the media telling us how everybody wants action. The message is that the American people strongly support climate action. But the New York Times itself issued a poll. They published it 2 days before the election last November. And they asked voters whether or how concerned they were about global warming, climate change. And more people were either not very concerned or not at all concerned than the number who were very concerned. And so we need to make sure that our representatives know this. We need to not be cowed into being afraid to discuss this with friends, neighbors, family members, et cetera. The public understand. They see the science. I think people are largely smart. People are discerning. And we just need to make sure that we don't get bullied into giving up, thinking that we've lost. And so long as the conversation keeps going, as long as we are attending sessions like this, then I think ultimately we'll win out. But we have to be strong. We have to stand up to the Biden administration and others right now while they have a bit of political power and try to ram these programs through.
Let me go to another question here.
Let me make a quick comment there. Pre-COVID, I think the public I always had confidence to reject alarmism. Carbon tax was rejected in Oregon and Washington State. Blue states rejected a carbon tax. The Washington Post has done a poll in 2019. How much are you willing to spend on climate? The vast majority of people not willing to spend more than $10 a month. But post-COVID, I think this is a really good question. People have given up many people have given up a lot of their rights. They gave up their jobs, their incomes, their financial security, their businesses. The government made them do it, and they pretty much just took it. We've been taking this for more than a year. It's still going on, and so I wonder if Joe Biden and Democrats, they've always wanted to go from a COVID lockdown to a climate lockdown, and I think that maybe they think we're vulnerable. So something to think about.
Very good. I have a question here from Kevin Mooney from the Daily Signal. He says it's for the whole group or anyone who would like to take it. Does the public at large buy into the concept of quote unquote carbon pollution? This is the phrase Team Biden uses through all of its public documents. How do all of you recommend pushing back in terms of communications / public relations on that? And on a related note, are the proponents of natural gas development making a mistake by pointing to lower emissions as the primary reason for supporting robust development, when in fact the primary reason should be that it's a cheap, affordable energy, source of energy that is key to American energy independence?
Yeah, if I can start on this, great questions, Kevin. Your first point dovetails with what I mentioned earlier. The American public don't buy into this. The American people are not hoodwinked, and we are being inundated with messages that we've lost the climate change debate. In fact, we're winning it. And more importantly, truth is winning out. So I would just say, stay firm, stay optimistic, hold to the truth. Regarding natural gas, that's a great point, because the natural gas industry, many of their actors back 10 years ago, they were bankrolling the climate activist groups because they saw the shutdown of coal power plants as being beneficial to them. So they're bankrolling environmental activism, climate alarmism, figuring that they would be the ones to clean up and benefit from shutting down coal. But I and others were telling them at the time, you're next on the menu. And if they're making their argument based upon emissions reduced, while certainly if you believe in a climate crisis, that's a benefit. I don't think that's a benefit. But really the reason why natural gas is benefiting the American public is because it's reducing energy prices. It's reducing electricity prices. And if we're going to talk about climate change as a reason for this, you're going to talk yourselves out of a job. You're going to talk yourselves out of an industry. So let's stick with the economics, and let's stick with the sound science.
And as for the natural gas component, I've been battling with some of my colleagues from the natural leaders in the natural gas industry that are supportive of what you're talking about. They're buying the rope to hand to the hangman. And I recall the famous Dietrich Bonhoeffer quote, first they came for the Jews, and then if there was no one left to stand up. And so they're eventually going to be eaten by the alligator they're trying to feed right now. It's a huge mistake. Maybe not this year, but it'll catch up to them at some point in the near future.
Yeah, could I, Jim, could I just disagree a little with James Taylor, your colleague at Heartland? Look, I don't think we're winning the debate. I think reality will eventually win the debate. Reality is a very hard thing to get around. So I do think we're going to win the debate. I think reality will do it. In the meantime, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars are going to be transferred to from the productive economy to the climate industrial complex just because of political power, not because of facts or arguments or the science. And so I think we are in a very difficult position, and eventually we will win, because the reality is that you can't reduce emissions. It's very difficult. It's incredibly expensive to the degree that they claim is necessary. And the climate is not going to respond to higher emissions the way they claim it is responding. So we're going to win, but in the meantime, the collateral damage can be colossal.
And just to wrap this up, I think climate realists, skeptics, whatever you want to call us, we've done a tremendous job over the last 25 years with the public, shaping the debate, responding to the changes in language that the left has tried to impose. Kevin's question mentioned carbon pollution. What I try to spend my time with, I can't convince the other side because they're true believers. But if we can convince just the people on our side and make it a 50-50 tie, then that's fine. The weak spot, though, however, is our representatives in Congress. They're very lazy. Everybody claims they're interested in the environment, but nobody wants to spend any time learning anything about it. And it's especially true of Republicans in Congress. They're very lazy. They're susceptible to using terms like pollution for CO2 emissions. And that's really the greatest challenge we have, to reach out to members and their staffs and educate them to not fall for the giant hoax that is climate.
Yeah, carbon is not free floating in the atmosphere causing global warming. Carbon dioxide is the molecule that we're discussing. And it is a very deliberately dishonest tactic to refer to this as carbon, which people think of as dirty, black, dark gray soot that's floating around in the atmosphere, when carbon dioxide is clear, it's odorless. But this is what we're fighting, not just in terms of definitions, but throughout the global warming debate. Is we have folks in the climate alarmist community who don't really worry about being honest or truthful. It's more about messaging and propaganda.
All right, we have a question here from Penny Starr from Breitbart News. Maybe Myron can take this one briefly. Can Myron Ebell or another expert expand on how Gina McCarthy could end up running our economy?
Well, I think she already does. If you look at the executive orders on climate, various nominated and confirmed officials like the OMB director are told that they must report to Gina McCarthy as the director of the White House National Climate Task Force. And if you look at some of the interviews she's given, I would point you to one on Grist that I watched. She was pretty smug about the fact that she's in charge and that this is a wonderful opportunity to completely turn the economy upside down and change people's lives. And isn't this going to be great? This great new world that I see, that she sees. So yeah, no, I think she's already in charge of the U.S. economy. And I think if you look at the executive orders and read what she's been detailed to do, that's what President Biden has essentially turned over the authority to her.
Excellent. Okay. Here's a question from Ryan Grant. He says, he asks, with all the money going towards climate action and the inability of the proposed solutions to deliver practical results, there will eventually be a backlash or reckoning of some kind, wouldn't you think? And how do you think that will unfold, and what would that look like?
Let me take that. So you would think that there would be a backlash. You would think that people would demand, tangible results for the money that's being spent. And as I mentioned earlier, people rejected carbon tax in blue states like Oregon and Washington. However, I think we're in a different era now. Post-COVID, it's appalling, shocking, how people have just, taken this extreme government action, just lying down. They're convinced the government knows what's best, public health establishment knows what's best. And possible that climate is different than that, but that is no longer how it's going to be sold. The Biden administration wants to go from COVID to climate. So it remains to be seen whether people will actually stand up and demand real benefits for the costs that they're going to bear.
Okay. Thank you, Steve Milloy. Let's see here. There's a question here. Yusef Robinson had asked during your presentations today, what percentage of the Green New Deal is devoted to actual environmental issues such as biodiversity, pollution, and oil spill prevention?
About 1/3 or less.
Should we be satisfied by that? Is that pretty good for government work?
Well, I mean, you have to include stuff like giving tax credits for electric vehicles as part of it and building electric charging stations. So if you think that that has some environmental purpose, then it's about 1/3.
Okay. J. Steve Wellstand asks via email before we began, are there any data or studies on how many birds are slaughtered each year by wind turbine blades? How many per turbine? The California Energy Commission website says that the newer designs, apparently raising the turbines higher off the ground, mitigate the bird kill. Is that true? And to what extent?
So the studies that have been published, the research that's been done indicates that the number of dead birds and bats, it's very important not to forget bats, are in the millions. That's the number that are being slaughtered to death each and every year by wind turbines. And on top of what are being killed in terms of the numbers, there's also the creation of aviary no-fly zones, which has a tremendous disruptive impact on the local ecosystems. This is something that if you truly are an environmentalist, you have to realize that carbon dioxide emissions, even if you believe in a climate crisis, it's not the end all, the be all, and the sole factor, or even necessarily the primary factor in terms of environmental health. So scientists at Harvard University 2 years ago published a paper, and they found that if you want to replace conventional energy on the electricity grid with wind turbines, you would have to cover literally 1/3 of America's landmass with wind turbines. And if we include electrifying vehicles, the transportation fleet, that number becomes 1/2. You talk about tremendous ecological, environmental destruction and devastation, covering literally 1/3 to 1/2 of America's landmass with wind turbines, is the worst thing we can think of in terms of the environment.
You know, and I would just add into this that, and this goes back to the last question as well, what portion of the Green Deal is about the environment? Well, I would say 0%. The purpose of the Green Deal is to gain control over the economy. Environmentalists, one thing I've learned over the last 30 years, they don't really care about the environment. They care about power, political power, and control, and everything is geared towards that. It's not about the environment. There's nothing environmentally friendly about wind turbines, solar panels, anything they want to do. They, dazzle people with, their concern for the environment, but their real goal is political power. And I mean, that's what the Green New Deal is all about. That's what Joe Biden's infrastructure plan is all about. Part of the $2.6 trillion infrastructure plan is really just a taxpayer campaign contribution to Democrats. It's going to be spent out over the next 4 elections, 2022, 24, 26, and 28. Money handed out by Democrats to maintain political power, maintain and increase political power. So, let's keep the focus on that.
Jim, it's not just birds that are at risk here. It's all types of environmental and species that are at risk. A recent UN biodiversity report said that the habitat loss was the greatest risk for biodiversity and increased extinctions. What's their solution to this? Destroy more habitat by paving over a high percentage of America with either solar panel farms or wind turbines.
Yes, very good. Let's see here. Peter Friedman has a question a little bit here on energy policy, on ethanol specifically. And he says it's a bipartisan criticism of energy policy that both parties seem to support ethanol mandates to the detriment of the American public. From my reading as a non-expert, with fuel requirements for farming, fertilizer, et cetera, there is no benefit in reduction of CO2. Other than certain limited areas with smog problems, the only group that benefits are corn farmers. Can the group comment on the costs, benefits, and any opportunity to repeal ethanol subsidies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we've published at the Heartland Institute over the years studies about how ethanol mandates have increased fuel prices for Americans. And much of that is simply the fact that Iowa was, still may be, we'll see what happens for potential reforms, but has been at the forefront of presidential primaries and caucuses at the beginning of the year. Presidential candidates, people who aspire to be presidential candidates, are terrified of alienating Iowa voters. I went to high school in Iowa, by the way. You shouldn't be that terrified, because although there are some interests who selfishly may want to see ethanol mandates thinking it will help the farm economy, still you'd be surprised how many people, including people in Iowa, will put their country's interests ahead of their own perceived self-economic interests.
Yeah, we've been fighting the ethanol mandate for a long time, and it's hopeless. And it should convince people never to start a subsidy or a mandate. Because if you do, you can never get rid of it, no matter how terrible it is, no matter it has terrible economic impacts, terrible environmental impacts. It's stupid. It always was stupid. But once you start it, you create a client class of beneficiaries who will never let go of it, and they are willing to spend a huge amount of money on political pressure and lobbying to keep free money coming in from the government. So this should be an example for everybody who says, oh, let's just subsidize it for a few years. We've subsidized wind for decades, solar for decades. They're talking about expanding the electric vehicle credits. These things are endless.
If I could just, chime in that, subsidies are bad, but they're kind of a good government issue. And right now, I don't think we're really facing a good government issue. We're facing a power grab from the left. And I think that we need to focus on the macro issue instead of the smaller good government issues. I mean, I'm all for, ending all energy subsidies and the ethanol program. But right now we're really facing, much more serious threats.
Very good. Ken Ivory asks, what can we expect a civilian climate corps, Justice 40, and climate justice to look like? Have you guys heard of those things? Do you know what we're talking about here? I'm, for one, very curious as to what exactly the definition of climate justice is.
Well, the definition of climate justice, I tweeted this out yesterday. There was a picture of Al Sharpton taking his private jet to Minneapolis to participate in the protest. Al Justice, of course, is a climate justice advocate. So that is climate justice. Al Sharpton flying on a private jet. This whole issue of climate justice, environmental racism, it's just another hoax. I had a good example of something I put on Junk Science last week. The Washington Post tried to run this story about the origin of the term environmental racism. It was totally wrong. They completely, erroneously, falsely described what happened to the guy that was arrested. The whole thing is just, there's no evidence that minority communities are suffering disproportionate health impacts from anything that are in the environment. This is a scam that was started during the Clinton administration, and it has just caught on. They've repeated it so many times, people just believe it. Environmental justice, racism, climate justice, all a hoax.
Ken Ivory from Utah, you have a lot of rural land and a lot of rural citizens in Utah, and you should be pleased to know that the definition of environmental justice communities includes rural Americans who are going to be, their economy is going to be destroyed from resource production under something called 30 by 30 and by destroying energy production. But you'll get handouts from the federal government because as rural Americans, you're now disadvantaged and you're defined as being in environmental justice communities. And one of the odd things about the Green New Deal light, the Biden jobs plan, is that 40% of the money is supposed to go to, quote, environmental justice communities. So they're going to have to expand the range of who qualifies as an environmental justice community to spend all this money if Congress goes along with this stuff. So be prepared. As for the civilian climate corps, who knows? But if the tax increases and all of this reckless, useless spending do cause a severe recession and even a depression, a lot of people are going to need jobs. So you may look more favorably on the civilian climate corps.
Excellent. Well, you have time for one more question, and I think this actually ties it right back to what we're probably going to be seeing a lot of on Earth Day and Earth Day +1 this week, and that is the idea that renewables can power our modern society, not just in the United States, but around the world. And so Ron Stein asks, how will renewables fill the void when the world has no oil derivatives that are the basis of the medical industry, militaries, aviation, cruise ships, and merchant ships? I mean, that's one angle of it. And I know Gregory's chomping at the bit to get to this one, but and I guess maybe just the broader point of the idea that, these goals are set in the Green New Deal and Biden's agenda that we can actually transfer to 100% renewable, whatever that means, in the very near future, in the lifetime of most people on this call. Seems to me a little far-fetched. Gregory, you want to take it?
Yeah, it's just an unattainable goal, this idea of complete renewables, to move away from where we are with oil and gas and coal-fired electricity. It's a bridge too far, is what Steve Milloy tweeted out yesterday.
Excellent.
Yeah, and let me just add, our society is 100% dependent on fossil fuels. There's nothing you can do. You can't build a solar panel. You can't build a windmill. You can't do anything. You can't build a nuclear power plant. You can't do anything without fossil fuels. It's not a goal. It's just sheer idiocy. It's a lack of understanding of how the real world works.
Well, and it's also, oh, sorry, Steve, go ahead.
No, fossil fuels are here to stay. I mean, maybe in the future there will be some magical technology that will replace fossil fuels, but fossil fuels remain the greatest technology ever developed, and they will be there for decades to come.
Yeah, and if I can add, and those are great points, this is also, as Greg mentioned, it's an unattainable goal, but it's something that politicians today can make all these commitments and pledges and speeches to curry favor with their base, but knowing full well that their successors in office will never be able to meet them. So a wind farm today that you see now and then here or there might look cute, but when it covers 1/3 to 1/2 of America's landmass, it's no longer cute. It's no longer a novelty. We're never going to get anywhere close to that before the American people realize, wait a second, we're destroying our country to try to meet this feel good, sound good mandate of 100% renewable. So we won't get there. Hopefully people will wake up and put a stop to this sooner rather than later. But this 100% renewable stuff, it's something that today's politicians promise for personal benefit, and their successors are going to have to explain it.
Hey, Jim, the week that Joe Biden was inaugurated was the first week since 1985 that the U.S. did not import 1 barrel of oil from Saudi Arabia. After decades and decades of trying to become energy independent, we finally are. And now he wants to trade that dependency that we had on the Middle East to a dependency on China for lithium and cobalt and rare earth elements. I'm not sure who I'd rather be relying on for our energy needs, but to go completely electric right now is just signaling we're going to be dependent on China. I don't, that's not good for us, and it's not good for the world.
Well put. Well, that we're out of time. I want to thank everyone here for being on this the special Zoom webinar, partnered with the Heartland Institute and the Competitive Enterprise Institute and junkscience.com and the CO2 Coalition. I encourage everyone here on this call to visit those sites regularly, and also visit the Heartland Institute and also our 2 main climate websites. We actually have 3 of them. I'll mention 4 actually. climaterealism.com, climateataglance.com. We have a climate conference coming up in Las Vegas, Nevada on October 15 through 17. And you can find out all the information there just by going to heartland.org. And you should also visit to see some of the science behind a lot of the points that were made in this presentation today, both on the science side and on the energy side at climatechangereconsidered.org. That's the project of the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change. And that is the definitive place to get the information you need to really back up what has been said here. Again, thank you all for attending. This will be put on Heartland's YouTube page. And if you have any questions we'd like to forward to these speakers here today, just contact me at jlakely@heartland.org. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.